This is just a quick additional video I'm making in the series in restoring this punch. And the reason I decided to make this video is something interesting has cropped up. It's one of those things that if you encounter, it can be very confusing. At least it confused me. I remember I first encountered this about 40 years ago, and it had me scratching my head for quite a long time. And it's one of those subtle things that until you think about it, it doesn't seem to be anything worth considering, but it's one of the strangest things with regard to repairing equipment like this. And as I said, the first time I encountered it, it had me confused for quite a long time. If you've been following the series on restoring this punch and reader, you'll know that I adjusted the position of the sprocket drive motor on the reader. And the reason I did that is because when I put a tape onto the reader, the full step position of the sprocket meant that the holes in the row that should have been aligned with the sensors was not correctly aligned. So I adjusted that, and the reader then worked fine. Now that particular tape had been punched on this machine, and as part of all testing, all restorations, I do a full set of fairly involved tests, and in this case it threw up an issue, and that is when I put one of my reference tapes onto the reader, it wouldn't read it. And when I did the same test that I'd done earlier by checking to see if the rows of holes were aligned with the sensors, they weren't, even though the sprocket was engaged with the sprocket holes. The sprocket holes were aligned correctly on both tapes with the actual punch holes, so they're all in the right position relative to each other. But the error was caused by the holes in the tape that I punched on this machine being spaced incorrectly. So that is, the gaps between each adjacent row was incorrect. It should be 0.1 inch, but it was slightly more than that. It was about a 20th of a millimetre too long, and then the cumulative error meant that even though there's only about 8 or 9 holes between the sprocket pin and the sensors in the reader, it was too far for the sprocket hole to line up with the sensor. And moreover, when I compared two tapes back to back, one from a reference tape and one from the tape punched on this machine, they didn't line up properly. And it was quite a significant error. It was out by, I guess, 0.1 inches over the distance of about 2 inches, which is quite significant. It should be less than a 20th of an inch over about 5 inches. So it was way too far out. Now, as I said, that tape had been punched on this machine, so it meant it had to be punching the holes at the wrong spacings. Now, of course, I've replaced the pulleys on this, so I could have made a mistake in counting the teeth on the original pulleys, but it wasn't really out far enough for it to be that. There has to be, of course, a finite number of teeth on each pulley. These are toothed belts. And so this brought me back to something, as I say, I first encountered many years ago, and it's one of these very weird things that if you encounter it, it's very unintuitive as to what's causing the issue. I've done a very brief sketch here of the layout of this machine with regard to the punch. So we have the lower sprocket, that's the sprocket down here that sits on the motor shaft. It's a stepper motor, by the way. We have the upper pulley, which is this one, and there's a 2-to-1 ratio between these two pulleys, and that's exactly the same as there was on the original. And then on this shaft, on this pulley, we have the toothed sprocket wheel that engages with the paper tape and drives it through the machine. Now, of course, because this is all fixed, there's no variability in this, so when the motor steps, it steps by the same angle every time. That means it turns this wheel by the same angle every time, turns this by the same every time, and so it moves the tape forward by the same amount every time, and then it punches a hole. Each move should be exactly 0.1 inches. However, it's adjustable, and the way you adjust it is very odd, and this is what I'm really getting to with this video, in that to adjust the spacing of these punched holes, what you do is rotate the body of the stepper motor. So on the back of this motor, which sits down here, there are a couple of clamp screws. There are some screws on the plate it sits on, but that's to tension the belt. It moves the relative position of the motor shaft relative to this shaft, and you can increase it or decrease it to change the belt tension. But they're not the screws that you use to adjust the spacing of the paper. As I say, they're clamp screws, and you rotate the body of the motor, and so the motor's sitting down here, and the shaft of the motor engages with this pulley, and as I say, to adjust the spacing of these holes, you rotate the body of the motor. And it's, if you think about it, it seems very counterintuitive, because it's a stepper motor. You'd assume that all that's going to happen if you move it is it would just effectively change the start position of the first hole in effect, and then all the rest would be spaced the same. But it's not the way it works. When you rotate the motor, it will increase or decrease the nominal spacing of the holes. It's kind of a subtle adjustment. About 20 degrees rotation of the motor will make about a 50th of an inch difference in the spacing of the holes, but it's enough when you look at a cumulative error to cause issues. So if you haven't encountered this, it's worth giving it some thought, because it is a very interesting thing, and as I say, it's one of the things that had me puzzled for a very long time when I first encountered it. So having said that, what I did is I came back into this, I adjusted the motor, ran some more tape, kept going back and forth until I got the spacing of the holes exactly right, and now I have the ability to punch tapes on this machine where the sprocket hole spacing exactly matches my reference. I also used a caliper as well to check the measurements on both the reference and now on the new punch tapes. Once I'd done that, I could then go back to the reader, readjust the motor on this. As I say, it was loose when I first started adjusting it, so I think this is maybe what someone was trying to correct. And now I can punch tapes with the correct spacing, and I can also read not only my reference tapes but also the tapes that are punched on this machine. So very interesting in the way the geometry on this works. It's actually because of the way the stepper motor works in terms of its step angle, but it's something that's very interesting when you start looking into it.